Good evening and welcome. I am Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the discussion about our latest research with the Diffley Partnership, Understanding Scotland's Economy, which tracks public perceptions of the economy in Scotland over time, and we publish it every quarter. So each quarter, Understanding Scotland helps us monitor and understand economic expectations, spending intentions and attitudes in Scotland, and this will be vital information for decision makers across all sectors. Before we get going, just to keep you all safe, I'd like to confirm there are no fire alarms, and if the fire alarm does go off, please proceed to the nearest exit. And as we've got Christine at the front, I'm sure she'll keep us right on where all the exits are. So we're recording the session. I've already explained about the speakers and the microphones to help the amplification in the room. If anyone is hard of hearing, please don't be afraid. Do come down the front. We don't want you struggling at the back to hear, so please do be, we're warm and we're welcoming down the front if you can't hear for any reason. I'd really like to thank Brodie's for hosting us in this beautiful room with an amazing view of the castle. We very much appreciate your support. And now, without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Christine to say a quick hello.
Hello, Christine O'Neill. I am the chair of Brodie's, but I'm also a trustee of the David Hume Institute. So welcome on behalf of DHI, but also on behalf of the firm to this venue. We're delighted to have the Institute in the building. Our own strapline is enlightened thinking, so it fits, we hope, pretty well with what we do in the day job. So thank you very much for coming along this evening. I'm going to hand back to Susan to cheer us in her inimitable way.
Thank you, Christine. We're here all together. Please do be friendly. Please don't be afraid of asking questions when we get to the discussion part. We really want to hear your thinking as well as the speakers here. So the speakers, Mark Diffley. I'm sure many of you know him. He's a researcher and pollster with more than 2 decades of experience, and we're delighted to be continuing our partnership with Mark and the team at the Diffley Partnership for the important piece of research. Shona McCarthy joined the Fringe Festival. Sorry, I knew I was going to get it wrong. I'm so used to just calling it the Fringe. The Edinburgh Festival Fringe Society as chief executive 7 years ago. I'm really hoping you haven't got the second 7-year itch, because I think you're doing a marvellous job. Shona has championed the Edinburgh Fringe as the world's leading performing arts festival and expo, founded on the principle of open access and freedom of expression. Shona has 33 years, that's very precise, 33 years experience working as in senior leadership positions, and was awarded the prestigious Eisenhower Fellowship for Innovation in 2014, making her part of the global network of leaders and influencers. She is a Nesta Cultural Leadership Award from 2007. She's also an honorary fellow of the University of Surrey and a visiting professor at Napier University. Gosh, I'm struggling with my words tonight. It must be the time of day. And an honorary fellow of the Marketing Society of Scotland. And last but not least is David Iser. He's Director of Research and Analysis and Investigations at the new body Consumer Scotland, the recently established statutory organisation for consumers in Scotland. Prior to joining Consumer Scotland in December 22, David was Deputy Director of the Fraser of Allender Institute, an independent economic research body based at the University of Strathclyde. And FAI, David led work on fiscal policy and the Scottish budget and socio-economic trends in the Scottish economy. So there's lots to draw on today, David. No pressure there. Mark will talk us through the findings, and then we'll have reflections from Shona and David before opening up the discussion to questions from the floor. So without further ado, over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Susan, and hello, good evening to everyone. So nice to see so many familiar and a few new faces. As well, thank you, Susan, for the introduction. Those of you that have heard me, this is a quarterly survey, of course, and those of you who have heard me address this group before and give the results will be familiar. I'm the kind of prophet of doom that tells everyone how dreadful everything is out there. One day, I hope I'm old enough to come along and tell you how things are improving. Although I'm afraid that won't be tonight. Although there are kind of, I think, some light shades of perhaps some optimism that are beginning to show in public attitudes. But we shall see, and I'll be very interested to hear to hear people's reflections, experiences, and any questions after I finish. This is both a snapshot of where opinion is at a point in time, as in now, and because we've been doing this for now quarterly for about 18 months, so since the autumn of 2021, it is a significant or an increasingly significant time series as well, and you'll see that in some of both my remarks and some of the visuals that I'll have up on the screen. That's really important. It's really important to know where the public is right now, but it's also equally important, I would suggest, to put current attitudes and current views in the context of where we were or where we have been over the last 18 months. And it's particularly important at a time like this. We all know, and we'll talk about it as the evening goes on, that we're still in the grips of a cost of living crisis. That is absolutely clear. If it's not clear from the kind of economic data that we see, it's certainly clear from public experiences, which is the focus of my remarks today. And if we do see that the shoots of recovery or the shoots of reduced pessimism that I will show in a few moments, then we may be starting to see attitudes and behaviours start to revert back to what we might consider to be normality, whatever that is. So a few just introductory remarks to begin with. This is just a bit about the survey. As I said, we run the survey every quarter. We're delighted to work with Susan and the team at David Hume Institute. We're also supported by our colleagues at Charlotte Street Partners and some of the communications and so on and so forth. So it's a real kind of team and joint effort. It's a large-scale survey, which gives us the ability, of course, as I say, every quarter to do some really significant analysis and actually to be much more certain, statistically certain, that what we are presenting and asserting is as true as it possibly can be, as representative as it possibly can be. So that's a really important bit of information, I think, to bear in mind here. Okay. So the important stuff is what are we finding? Now, to set this in a bit of context, we ask people, as you see in lots of opinion polls and lots of surveys that come and go, we ask people what's on your mind, what are you worried about at the moment? Tell us the top 3 things, and we present a list, a long list, and you can see some of the items that are on that list, and we ask people to tell us what the kind of top 3 things are that they're worried about. This is the time series going back from the autumn of 2021 to now, and you can see, you don't need me to go through every number or every trend there. You can quite clearly see what's happening, right? So back in the midst of time, 18 months ago, there wasn't a great deal of concern about the cost of living. It wasn't really a feature. Inflation was quite low. People were not feeling the pinch in the way that they are now. And you can see over the course of the last 18 months how concerned about the cost of living. I mean, it's not surprising, right? We can all feel it. We can all experience it. And it's borne out in the data. So we can see a more than doubling of concern about the cost of living and inflation. The other key issue, of course, is healthcare and the NHS. And that is what we in our business call a kind of perennial issue. I mean, it's there all the time. Concern about it obviously peaks more in the winter. So evidenced by the fact that this survey conducted within the last 3 weeks, so towards the beginning of February, showed that actually that is the issue that's a primary concern. But in winter months, that's not a huge surprise. And of course, a lot of these issues are correlated, right? So concern for the economy, concern about poverty and inequality. We're asking people to select what they think are their huge concerns, but there's a lot of crossover. These are not kind of mutually exclusive. These are not mutually exclusive issues, but our two primary concerns as a population are what's happening to our cost of living and what's happening to healthcare. I mean, and interestingly, of course, we're in the, it's not the focus at all tonight, but we're in this, the leadership contest for the next leader of the SNP and First Minister. And it's clear, actually, particularly in the last few days, that the candidates there are quite keen to move on to these issues as well. They recognise that actually the big concerns out there are these, and they're actually really keen, I think, to move the debate on because they see data like this and they see statistics like this, and they actually do realise, if you want to attract votes and if you want to be on the right side of the pin, you need to be addressing these issues. Okay, and when we dig a bit further into economic priorities, so we ask what your overall kind of priorities are, what's concerning you, and then we dig into economic priorities. So we ask, of these economic factors, which ones are of most concern at the moment, and we get very similar scores here. So in the economic sphere, which is our primary concern this evening and for the survey, the cost of living and inflation is overwhelmingly the priority of the public. So that really is what's going on out there and what's worrying and bothering people at the moment. Okay, so that's, I think, useful kind of context by which to think about some of the other data that we collect around things like optimism, income, standard of living, reactions to the cost of living and so forth. So that's worth kind of bearing in mind. Now, the kind of second thing I guess I wanted to discuss and consider are people's reflections on the current state of the economy and their own kind of personal financial situation. So on the left here, these are questions about the economy. And on the right, the two charts here about your own financial situation. Now, we ask this in two ways. We ask people to look back, how does the state of economy, how do you think about the economy compared to a year ago? And then we ask them, which I think is actually probably more important for discussion and reflection, what do you think is going to happen in the next 12 months? Now, what we can see here is by no means a return to what we might consider to be normal, but it is, and you'll see that particularly from the pie chart in the bottom left here, we do see the shoots of some sort of recovery. I'm not quite sure, but certainly a reduction in the level of pessimism that we reported back in November when we last conducted the survey. Now, what seems to be happening is that you can see here, so if we alight on this one, we've got, when we ask people to consider whether they think the general economic conditions will be better or worse or the same in the next 12 months, we see that, still overwhelmingly, people think that conditions will be worse. So about 2/3 of us think they will be worse. But actually what's really important here is that this figure, this -15, is actually means that -50. So that figure was 40% in November last year, and it's now 25%. But people aren't jumping straight from feeling that things are getting worse to going to get better. They're more seeing this as a bit of a transition through, well, maybe it's not going to get absolutely so much worse. Maybe it will get a little bit worse or even kind of stay the same. So this is not, by which I mean, we're not kind of going straight from, this is the end of the world to, oh, look, there's a bright new dawn over here. We're rather just, I think, a bit more kind of reflective, and we're probably saying maybe for some of us at least, maybe we've gotten to the kind of bottom here, and that things may be starting to improve slightly. So I wouldn't want to kind of overplay this. I mean, interestingly, I was at a kind of business dinner a couple of weeks ago with one of the big banks, and their chief economist was telling me that some of the indicators that he's seeing from his clients are actually quite positive. And that his view was that the kind of general economic situation, or rather the business environment, was improving a little bit. And I wonder whether some of these are kind of lagging indicators from the public. In other words, I think that I suspect if things we would probably see it through businesses first, so the number of startups, the number of successful startups, the amount of investment and other indicators, and we would probably see that feeding through into public attitudes and behaviours maybe a bit later, but happy to have that discussion. And we see something similar-ish with personal finances as well. So we see fewer people telling us that so this is the bottom right here, we see fewer people telling us that their own personal finances, they think are going to get a whole lot worse in the next 12 months. But they're not jumping into saying that everything's going to be rosy. They're rather kind of hedging their bets. Maybe things will, maybe kind of flatline, stay the same. And that's, I think, that's really interesting and instructive. What we see here, so we're looking at three things here, right? We're looking at the point in time, which is, and the comparison with the last quarter, which I've just shown on the previous slide. And here's the trend over the last 18 months. And you can see for all these indicators, whether they're economic or your own financial situation, also whether you're talking about the last, looking back or looking forward, we appear somewhat to have hit the floor and are kind of tentatively on an upward curve. These are kind of net scores where we subtract people that tell us things are going to get worse from people that tell us that things are going to get better, and we put that into a net score. And that, of course, has always been minus. So even back in 2020, in 2021, before the current crisis really hit, lots of these figures were somewhat in the negative, but actually they went down quite significantly, particularly actually in the first half of last year. And we're now just kind of starting to see we're starting to see some return, not back to where things were 18 months ago, but possibly on the upward trend. I would caution against kind of thinking that, when we meet again in 3 months' time, these are going to shoot up again. That may be the case. I'm not kind of convinced, but we can have that discussion. But I think it's that there is something, when we collect 4 different indicators and they're all kind of moving in the same direction, it sort of tells me that something is afoot. But whether that lasts and whether that's a trend now, I guess is impossible to say, and is subject to all sorts of economic and sort of financial indicators, which are as yet, I suspect, unknown. So that's the kind of general economic situation, how people are feeling, levels of pessimism, optimism, and so forth. We ask people some really interesting questions, I think, about their levels of income and the sufficiency of their income to meet certain criteria around their behaviours and their standards, their standard of living, and so forth. And we can see something, I think, really interesting here, which is that, it's fair to say that for the majority of people, their income is not sufficient, is not satisfactory, does not meet either their kind of broad standard of living or specifics around, meeting household bills or any commitments, any kind of paid or unpaid commitments that they have. So broadly speaking, for each of the indicators, the yellow and the sort of very light blue scores are in a negative, so people who are dissatisfied, and the bars on the left here are more satisfied. So you can see, for instance, that broadly about when we ask about your income level, that about a third of us are satisfied with our incomes, and about half of us are dissatisfied. That's quite a big gap. I mean, again, it's perhaps not that surprising given what we know and what we've talked about in terms of the cost of living and inflation and the inability or the pessimism that people have around the cost of living. But nonetheless, this is really, really useful data. And of course, what this shows, when you dig into the data, which is a theme which I've spoken about before and which is as clear from this survey as from others, is that this is not an equal crisis, right? So people are not feeling this equally. Your satisfaction, for instance, if we look at this top, this top line here around, just broadly around income levels, this is your satisfaction with your income will depend on quite a few things. It will depend on whether you have children. This was a theme that we had before. So broadly, the more children that you have, the less satisfied you are with your income, right? And that it meets all your ability to live your life, pay your bills, meet your commitments, and so forth. And unsurprisingly, it's a factor of where you live. So when we dissect these numbers by the SIMD, the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which many people here will be familiar with, if you live in one of Scotland's most deprived communities, satisfaction or dissatisfaction with income is around 60%. If you live in one of Scotland's most affluent communities, dissatisfaction is around 37%. So not quite double, but you can see there, and it's a linear relationship, right? So it goes through the five SIMD characteristics, and the same can be said for these other issues as well. Now, one thing we did this time, which we hadn't done before, and which I think is really interesting and quite instructive, is that we asked about whether your employment provides you with enough paid hours. So, in other words, whether your dissatisfaction with income is as a result of not being able to have enough work to do, or not being able to do extra hours, or whatever. And actually, I think to some extent, at least, this is not the issue here, right? This is not the issue. People are not dissatisfied with their income because they can't work enough. They are dissatisfied because their income isn't high enough, right? So I think for about 60% of people, that is not an issue. Now, if you dig into the data, it is a bit of an issue, I have to say, with people who are working part-time. So quite a few people who work part-time told us that actually they would like to have more hours, and that is a bit of a barrier to income satisfaction. But fundamentally, I think this is not about employment, or the availability of employment, or the availability of hours in your job. It's more about your level of income and the cost of living and inflation and those other things that we've already discussed. And again, this just puts the same figures onto a trend here, so we can see this over the last 18 months, and you can see how income adequacy measured by satisfaction with your income has just really kind of fallen off a cliff in particularly at the beginning of 2022, and it has flattened somewhat. But as with some of the other indicators here, once you hit the bottom, there's only really one place you can go. You can't go any further down, and you either flatten off or you start to see things bounce back a little bit. I don't think with income adequacy we're seeing much sign, or any sign, I should say, of things coming back. The indicators that we looked at earlier around pessimism and optimism, and I illustrated how there may be some signs that things maybe for the future are starting to look a little bit perhaps less pessimistic, but that does not translate into people's current views of the adequacy of their incomes, and we need to be really, really clear about that. So these kind of changes that we see, -1, -2, and the other two are equal. They're either equal, or the differences between this time and last time are statistically just kind of unimportant or negligible. So what we're seeing here is that people continue to be as dissatisfied with their income broadly, and in terms of how it's adequate enough to meet their commitments. Is a real issue. And again, I won't go into it too much now, and you can see it in the data which we'll share. This is not an equal picture, right? And again, some of the same issues where you are, the size of your household, particularly in terms of children, where you live, your employment status, obviously with income. All these things will impact on on that. Okay, so let's just move on and talk about financial fragility, because we were keen, we haven't asked these questions before, and we were keen to ask some this time. How would you cope with a kind of sudden or unexpected financial situation that you hadn't planned for? And we've basically got 4 examples here, which you can see. 2 of them were just financial. You know, you got an unexpected bill for X amount or Y amount, in this case £100 or £500, and others were more kind of behavioural, around, you know, you need to get another job, or your housing costs go up, and how do you how do you cope? And some of these are deeply sort of depressing, of course, some of the numbers here, but actually perhaps not that surprising. But actually, I mean, we've said alarmingly high. I think these are really high, actually, if you think about it. You know, the fact that if you were presented with an unexpected bill of £100, you know, about a quarter of us wouldn't be able to cope with that. I mean, sort of let that sink in for a minute. I mean, that is a really quite alarming and very, very worrying number. 1 in 4 of us wouldn't be able to cope with that. And of course, if you're presented with a much higher unexpected bill, the number obviously goes up to well over approaching half of us. So you know, these aren't solutions, but this is evidence to show again the depth of what we're facing at the moment. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, and again the data is very clear on this, again, it won't surprise you, is not equal, right? So you know, the 25% figure, which is presented there, if you're in a household with children, that goes up to 34%. If you're in one of Scotland's most deprived neighbourhoods, it goes up to 43%. That's for an unexpected bill of £100. An unexpected bill of £500, where about 45% of us say we wouldn't be able to deal without having to take out a loan or borrow some money. That goes up to 58% amongst households with children, and 63% amongst people from Scotland's most deprived neighbourhoods. So, you know, these are they are patterns of data which, you know, one would absolutely expect, completely intuitive, but nonetheless fairly sort of difficult to read, I think, and think about. I mean, these are really stark, these figures. Interestingly, we asked about, you know, how would you be able to cope with getting another job? How confident would you be? And it's quite interesting here, because I think, I mean, as we can see, it's in the bottom left here. You know, approaching 6 in 10 of us are not confident really that we would find another job if we had to, which kind of jars, I think, a little bit with what we were talking about previously, which is that people find that it's not about their employment. My own take on this is that I think people interpreted this as finding another job with a higher income, or with a higher salary that enabled you to meet these financial, you know, unexpected financial circumstances. Okay, and moving towards the end of my remarks, and this is something that we've spoken about, and people who've been to this session before will be familiar with. We ask people about what their response to the cost of living crisis is. So these are kind of behavioural issues. You know, what do you do in order to deal with it, to make ends meet, to survive, and so forth. And we can sort of see that, okay, not a huge amount has changed. The figures to the right are comparisons with November. We can again see that, you know, the most common response to the cost of living crisis is to cut back on energy use, and equally to cut down on non-essential non-essential purchases. We see in the data here, there's some quite interesting things. So the population, or the sector of the population which is most likely to cut back on energy, are older people. So the older you are, the more likely you are to cut down on your energy. But the younger you are, the more likely you are to cut down on buying non-essential items, and particularly for households with children, which is a kind of common theme of what we're talking about tonight. And this is the trend, right, over 18 months. So you can see, well, for most of these indicators, things haven't changed hugely. There are patterns here. I sort of think of these, they split into kind of three types here. They're actually kind of essential things that people will do. They're actually kind of fundamentals here, right? So cutting down on your heating, cutting out non-essential stuff, which will include specifics like leisure activities, and not putting the heating on, are the kind of staples of this. So things that people tell us for the last year, pretty much, that they've been doing since the crisis began. And then there are kind of more discretionary things here, which people will do in smaller numbers, but which are still quite important, and they're still quite high. Proportionately, they're not as high. So people will donate less to charities. They're more likely to take money out of their savings if they have any, or conversely put less money into savings. And then there are the kind of more, I suppose, there's a group at the bottom which are still significant, but which contain lots of kind of different behaviours, I suppose, both from kind of cutting down financially, whether that's cutting down on meals, or actually suffering anxiety and mental health stress because of the crisis, which we see is always a feature for about a quarter of the population, and that hasn't changed. So we may see slight seeds of kind of more optimism or less pessimism, I think, to be more accurate. But actually, some of the kind of fundamental reactions to the crisis are actually just as prevalent now as they have been throughout. On that cheery note, that's the end of my remarks. I hope that was interesting. There's much more. We've only really just kind of scratched the surface. There's so much more in the data. Happy to answer questions later on. But Susan, that's me.
Thank you, Mark. Lots in the data to think about, but we're going to hotfoot it on to Shona, who's going to kind of give us the so what on her take and reflections, and then we'll just go straight on to David after you've spoken, Shona.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Mark. It's always interesting for somebody from the culture and arts sector to be invited into a space like this, because we rarely are. So thanks ever so much. If I put my fan on, sorry for the men in the room, but it's my menopausal fan, as I call it. So just bear with me, and sorry for the noise. I'm going to talk more from the heart than anything else, because it's kind of odd to be in a room when you've heard all those stats and talking about festivals and arts and culture. I could start by saying I think it's really interesting at the moment that Ukraine is investing in its cultural sector. I'll just leave that with you for a second. And I think the thing that kind of really preoccupies my thinking right now is that it's totally understandable why a government will focus on the cost of living crisis and will focus on healthcare. I just wonder who's asking the question of what is our society going to look like when we come out the other side of this? What is the long view? It's, of course, the kind of reactive thing is to address those very immediate issues that are felt by all of us. But what is the long view? What do we look like as a city? What do we look like as a nation? And I'll go right back to why the Edinburgh Festivals were set up in the first place. Forgive me if there are people in the room who already know this story or have heard it 100 times, but the fact that the Edinburgh Festivals were set up in 1947 as a means to reconcile people after the horrors of the Second World War is kind of not lost on me today. And we've grown organically over those 75 years, having started with this kind of kernel of something vital and something important at a moment of strife and a moment when it was really needed. And we've organically grown to the point where at the last economic impact study, which I think was done in 2015 and was very conservatively estimated, that the festivals collectively put 250 million back into the economy of Edinburgh and employ some 4,000 people. The Fringe alone is now the biggest performing arts festival in the world, which is kind of less interesting to me than what it actually is about. And it's a festival that speaks in some way to Scottish values of openness, inclusion, freedom of expression, lack of censorship, everyone's right to have a voice and to express themselves creatively. And all of those things, I think, are just incredibly important and incredibly meaningful. And we now have this collection of festivals in this city that over 75 years have grown to become the equivalent of a FIFA World Cup as a ticketed event, second only to the Olympic Games. And I've just come back from London and I was speaking to I think it's the 189th Culture Minister of the UK government yesterday, just in my 7 years in the job. Joking, don't record that. And I was saying, if you were to kind of create this thing now from fresh and put it out to tender for any city in the UK to bid for it, you can be absolutely certain it would come with a £100 million price tag of investment to make it happen. But because we've grown organically over 75 years, there's a level of just, they'll be all right. It'll just happen. It'll just, reoccur again every year. And as we've seen this year already with the Film Festival, which was also 75 years old, and the Film House, it doesn't just organically and magically happen like that every year. And there is a serious existential threat to what we've grown here in Edinburgh. And I'm speaking personally this evening because this is my 8th year in the job. I came here because of the Edinburgh Fringe. I came here because I thought it was the most exciting, phenomenal, amazing festival in the world, because it isn't just a festival, it's an expo, it's a global meeting place, it's where business is done, it's where screen commissioners from all over the world, producers, theatre directors, festival directors from all over the world come here to this city every year to find and buy new work and to take talent and to put it onto our screens, to put it onto our radios, and it's a phenomenon. And whenever you're outside of Edinburgh and you look in at it, you look at it with envy. And, I grew up in Belfast going, oh my God, look what they have over there. And when I go around the world now, whether it's New York or whether it's South Korea to talk about the Edinburgh Fringe, its global reputation and the global reputation of Edinburgh as a festival city is recognised and valued so much outside of here that it's really quite extraordinary. And I feel incredibly privileged to be in this role. But I also feel acutely aware that I'm only the temporary custodian of something that is built on the shoulders of the giants that went before me and that really belongs to Edinburgh and belongs to Scotland. And I just don't want the thing to break whilst I'm here as its current custodian. And I say this really seriously because there will rightly be a focus on health and welfare and poverty and food banks and all of those things, rightly, over the next couple of years as we try to come through this crisis. But when I see Mark's stats of, and largely, particularly the Fringe, has been a self-financing festival. So its whole ecosystem is dependent on artists paying a registration fee to be part of it and selling tickets. But when you see stats that say, 68% of people will have no disposable income or are not going to be spending it on luxuries or essentials, and when you see the other bit of our income, which is charitable donations, and it's 41% of people are going to be less likely, and if they are going to give to charity, you can be damn sure culture is going to be somewhere down the bottom of the list. That we do have a real risk, and I'm kind of welcoming this opportunity to speak in spaces like this to say, you have something amazing, you have something extraordinary, you have something that is of an Olympic scale and status that's held in this city, and it is endangered. And I haven't heard a single one of the 3 candidates currently presenting themselves as the next leader of the SNP and First Minister mention culture or the arts once. And it just strikes me as odd for not just Scotland actually, but these nations of the UK, that it's what we're known for all over the world. It's what we're recognised for. We punch way above our weight and size for what we do in music and in gaming and in film and in the performing arts. And yet, whenever it comes to moments of crisis, we tend to kind of push it to the bottom rung of the ladder. So your your presentation here, Mark, fills me with a deeper sense of dread. And I guess coming right back to Christine's opening remarks, I think we need enlightened thinking. And I think we need thinking that is beyond the short term and the immediate and the reactive. And I'm just slightly worried at the moment that we're not seeing that. And the last thing that really concerns me is that myself and all of my colleagues, I've worked in the arts for 35 years now, and everybody I know who's worked in this sector has tried really hard in recent years in particular to address issues around inclusion and diversity and affordability for people from any walk of life, no matter what their socioeconomic background, to be able to be creative and to be able to be part of the arts. We've made enormous strides in this. You only need to look around this city and look at the level of diversity that happens every summer to know that the festivals are having an impact in this space. You only need to know that 900 of the shows that are on the stages of the Edinburgh Fringe are from Scotland, to know that this is providing a real kind of economic, cultural accelerant for local creatives and talent. But the more that we go down this road of only those at the top rung of the ladder are going to be able to afford to even come as audience members, what on earth is it going to be like when you start to think about who gets to participate? And there are unintended consequences to very well-meaning things like the new short-term lets legislation or the proposed new ban on advertising, alcohol advertising. But the two organisations that helped the Edinburgh Fringe survive COVID were Johnny Walker Princess Street and Edinburgh Gin. And on one hand, you've got public sector funding saying, we've got nothing in the coffers, you're going to have to be more imaginative, you're going to have to look elsewhere. But it feels to me like the doors are all closing at the moment. And I do think it's a moment of existential crisis. So just when you look at stats like that, it's kind of interesting to just think about the impact it's having on other things, like the cultural life and the cultural reputation of Edinburgh as a city and Scotland as a nation. I'll stop blethering now.
Thanks. I'm going to stand up if that's okay so I can see everybody. So thank you very much to Susan and Mark for the invitation to be here. I'm an economist, so normally I'm the one bringing the bad news and being the grim reaper, so I'm very happy that Mark's playing the lead role on that tonight. But I thought I'd just say a couple of words, if that's okay, about Consumer Scotland, because I'm sure most people here are probably thinking, not heard of Consumer Scotland, what is it? So Consumer Scotland was established in April last year. We are a new body to represent the interests of consumers in Scotland, public body, accountable to Parliament, not to government. We're not a regulator. We work closely with the regulators, but we're not a regulator. We're not a campaign organisation, but we advocate for policy change to ensure that markets work well and fairly for consumers in Scotland. And we do that on the basis of robust evidence and analysis. And the Understanding Scotland report that Mark's presented tonight is a great example of the type of evidence that informs the work that we do. Gives us a really clear sense of the way in which economic trends are affecting the experience of consumers in the economy. And I think one of the things I'm really struck by in seeing the report is just how useful the report is now that it's been going for that 18-month period. And what that means is that you can really see where there are clear trends, persistent trends in the data, rather than things just being a blip in the data or something that's, even if you have two a survey at 2 points in time, very difficult to know what's going on there. But a real strength of this now is that it's been going for 18 months, and I hope to see it continuing for some time to come. So I was asked to give some reflections. So here are 3 reflections on the report. The first one is reiterating the point Mark made about financial precarity. Despite having for over 10 years written and analysed issues of inequality in Scotland and written a number of reports on that, it never ceases to amaze me just how striking those statistics on financial precarity are. A quarter of households in Scotland unable to meet that unexpected bill of £100, as Mark said. And clearly that has profound impacts on the households who are in that position themselves. We know that financial stress has big impacts on people's health and well-being, and in fact those impacts can be transferred across generations within a household and persist for a long time. But that financial precarity, I think, it's also difficult to deny that will have an impact in terms of the wider economy's resilience to macroeconomic shocks, whether those are cost of living type shocks that we're seeing at the moment or pandemic type shocks that we saw previously. So I was really struck by that. Second thing that I was struck by, I don't think Mark mentioned this one specifically, but it was that stat that over half of respondents, 55% I think, now think the country is heading in the wrong direction. And that's one of those ones that you can really see a clear trend. That's not just a blip, it's not just February blues or whatever. You can see that having risen persistently for over a year now. I don't know that I have a good explanation for what's going on there. I mean, obviously that's coincided with the cost of living issue, but I'm not sure if that's how people would necessarily interpret a question about direction that the economy is going in. I don't know. So that one was interesting. The final reflection was just in terms of the outlook for the cost of living crisis and how that might be reflected in future iterations of the survey. I mean, of course, I think no surprise really to see the NHS and cost of living standards at the top of the chart of people's concerns. In terms of the cost of living crisis, to me it feels like we're potentially on the cusp of the next phase of that crisis. What I mean by that is I think clearly we're probably past peak inflation. We may well be at or very close to peak interest rates. So what we may start to see is that we actually begin to get a bit more of a positive narrative, at least in media discussion of this. And in fact, by the end of the year, we could be looking at inflation of less than 4%, maybe even less than 3%, depending on whose forecasts you want to believe. And so that, as I say, that really might sort of begin to give this sense that things are returning back to normal. But of course, just because inflation is falling, that doesn't mean that prices are falling. Certainly doesn't mean they're getting back to levels pre-crisis. Certainly not for things like prices of food and energy, which are likely to remain very much elevated relative to where they were before the crisis, even once inflation has got back to normal. Similarly with interest rates, we've all read lots about interest rates increasing, but for a lot of the people who will be affected financially by that, the impact is actually yet to really hit their budgets. So sort of interesting possibility that we get a sort of bit of a schism between some of the narrative that we might start to see emerging and what people are actually feeling in their in their real lives, if you like. And it will be very interesting, I think, to see how those two things play out in future iterations of the survey. But we certainly shouldn't forget, even if we do begin to see these positive stories, positive narratives about the economy, these pressures are very much likely to persist for a much longer period. So those are my 3 reflections, really. The scale of financial precarity, the increase in the percentage you think the country is going in the wrong direction, and in a sense a warning that I think the cost of living pressures will potentially persist for a prolonged period, even as the economic news appears to be getting better. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, all three of you. Before I go out to the audience, is there anything Shona or Mark wants to come back on anything David said, or anything, any extra comments before we open it up to questions?
No, I mean, only to sort of, I suppose, just briefly point out, we didn't include, I mean, not everything is included in the presentation. You'll see it in the report. I mean, the stat that you pointed out is a very good one, but it's the interpretation of it, which I think is you can read into it. It's very interesting. In and of itself, it's a very interesting piece of information, right direction, wrong direction. But you can kind of put all sorts of sort of political and other interpretations on it, which is why we didn't talk about it tonight. But I think David's absolutely right to point out that that's a key feature.
Always jumps out at me in the data is the stark difference between male and female, the stark difference in ages. There are really different responses, particularly on women responding at a much higher rate to say cost of living is a concern, and you know it jumps out every time, I think. And that the stat around parents I think is really strong. When you've got so many parents losing sleep, what is the long-term impact, back to what Shona said, for the next generation? So there was a labour market question in there for me, so I'm just going to give Sian, I can't see him there, I'm going to come to you in a minute, Sian, because we talked a bit at the last Understanding Scotland event about the number of people taking on second and even third jobs, and that's 16% of people wanting additional hours. It dawned on me at the weekend, I was shopping and I was listening to two people in the supermarket talk, and one of the people was telling her colleague, I've just had my hours cut today. She'd just been 2 hours knocked off her shift. And they said, but we need you, we're busy. And they're like, well, they can't afford me today, apparently. And she'd lost those 2 hours every day that week. And you just think, for that woman, and she was saying, you know, how am I going to feed my kids this week? That's a massive impact. And when you're in a nice, secure job, you forget that there are people that that's happening to every day. And I think it's really important in a room like this, with people discussing the economy, that we remember we are really lucky if we're not in that precarious financial situation. So that's my two pennyworth from an anecdote I saw at the weekend. Sian, you told us last time about some people beginning to take on second and third jobs. Do you want to just share that with, because we've got quite a different audience today?
Yeah. It's different in 3 months, but we saw a fairly dramatic increase in the amount of people that are inquiring about second jobs, the impact that it would have on their taxation, and generally, if I don't want to dress it up, it was a desperation, and I think the feeling was desperate, much more desperate, just backing up, with the research. So what we see now, sadly, is that where it was a workers' market last year, it's changed very quickly. And we've seen far more availability in the market and in the marketplace of candidates, particularly at the lower levels. Kind of ties in with what you said about, people getting their hours cut, people getting laid off. We've seen that in construction and shown, I'm afraid, hospitality as well. That's where we've seen a quick drop or a quick increase in available workers. So yeah, we've seen that generally change quite rapidly in the space of 3 months.
The word you used last time was fluidity, which stuck with me, because we're talking about people's lives and saying that there's much more fluidity in the labour market. If you hear that, that's actually redundancies, and it means it's much less choice for anyone looking for a job at the moment, maybe. Any who wants to start us off with a question? Gemma, you're smiling. Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. Really loved all of your contributions. The bit that really jumped out for me in the stats, Mark, was the people saying that poverty and inequality was less of a concern and cost of living had risen up. So those two were like the sort of inverse of each other. What's your analysis on what that is? Is it about people starting to, is cost of living more acceptable to say that you're worried about that themselves? Is poverty something that you talk about in relation to other people, and cost of living is kind of acceptable for everyone to say, yes, I'm struggling with this? Or how do you interpret sort of that? And was there a difference in, different categories of people sort of reporting that? Because I think that's really interesting. Is inequality getting better? I don't think so. But is the is the sort of lower to middle starting to squeeze together and become more equal? Like what's kind of going on there with that?
I'll pause you.
Yeah.
I can see Emma nodding vigorously, so I'm going to bring you in.
Yeah, thank you. To like Gemma, that was the statistic that stood out for me. I work for a debt help charity that predominantly provides support for households on the lowest income. And where it took my mind to was actually this week, the cross-party working group on poverty in the Scottish Government produced a report that was about poverty and stigma. And my reflections would be, not to answer the question for you, Mark, but tapping into where you went to, Gemma, is that there is still so much stigma associated with poverty and with debt. And that's not the conversation that people want to have. And there's something in the moment of the cost of living crisis that, because it does cut across many sections of society, there's an acceptability about it, but we still don't have an acceptability around poverty and debt, and the stigma is a thing that people don't want associated with that thing. But yeah, that was absolutely, for me, jumping out.
So there's probably sort of a methodological and then a sort of maybe an analytical answer to it. Well, answer to it, an interpretation of it. So there's probably two things I would say. One is that, the question, what we're trying to do with this question is to give people a sense of their priorities, right? So there could be a whole load of things that are bothering you, and we're asking you to shoehorn that into three sort of specific things from the long list that we're giving. So it's always kind of worth bearing that in mind. People are looking at it, they're looking at the list, and they're thinking, okay, what are the three big things here? So that's not to say that there are, I suppose I'm saying that because that's not to say that for anyone there aren't other things, but we're trying to get a sense of priorities here rather than an exhaustive list of everything that is worrying everyone at any particular point in time. So we're asking people to make choice, and that's a deliberate kind of strategy from our design point of view. The other is that I think there may be something to do with stigma. I absolutely couldn't tell you that. The data doesn't point to that. My analysis of it probably would be that, I suppose, putting it bluntly, it's easier to, or probably more likely that you would say that poverty and inequality is a big issue in times that we're not all kind of facing a big financial crisis, if you see what I mean. So when maybe the cost of living, back in this time last year or earlier on in earlier waves of this, if you're not, inflation, cost of living, it's not really that big a deal to me. Actually, I'm more worried about, other social issues. But actually, when we're all kind of feeling the squeeze, we're probably much more likely to identify the things that are absolutely most impacting on us at any particular point in time. That would be, I think, my interpretation of it, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Mark. Shona or David, want to comment? No. Who wants to go? Oh, run of hands.
Hi, thank you so much for the fascinating presentation, Mark, and for other people's reactions, really. Can I ask if you what we know about digging down a bit further about people's actual expenditure? Because, of course, this was all based on pretty general attitudinal questions about how much you're worried about this, that, and the other, and so on. But I think the ONS does work actually following a lot of people about their actual. So you can look at the actual transactional level of what they're doing. And in particular, can you comment on this issue, which I know is a bit of a chestnut that someone's raised, about people's financial management skills? Because it does seem that there are clearly a personality issues, that some people will make incredible sacrifices to make sure they've still got £500 left to cope with the crisis, whereas other people on quite large incomes, they struggle to pay £100 just before payday. And I mean, what do we know from the actual transactional behaviour and how people manage these things? And I wonder whether Dave might want to also comment from the consumer angle, because I'm conscious that the banks and so on are constantly trying to push various, quotes, financial management products on people, which may or may not be very helpful. In some cases, I think are actually encouraging people to get into debt. And I wonder if there's any comment on that.
I suspect the next question might be related to that. Is it?
Yes.
Yes.
Well spotted. My name is Jonathan Brill. My company is called Eduvate, and we're concerned with elevating levels of financial literacy amongst large swathes of the population. And so the question really is, do you get any sense from the work that you've done so far that having a more financially literate population would make a little bit more resilience in the way people handle things, the financial management that's being talked about, but also potentially reduce what you talked about in terms of financial pessimism? Thank you.
Do you want me to take a stab at those?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, and I was going to bring in Sheila on the Great Risk Transfer in a minute, if that's okay. You go first.
okay. Shall I go first? I mean, they're really good questions. I have to sort of limit myself to what's evidenced from the data, right? So I think the first question is really interesting. You don't see, you can see people in much better financial, or on the face of it, much better financial situation, evidenced by their income, also telling us that they would struggle to pay an unexpected bill. I mean, self-evidently, they are fewer in number than people who have lower incomes, right? Which is why I discuss those trends. But I mean, the ability to meet an unexpected bill isn't exclusively a problem for people with low incomes. It's a reflection on lifestyle, other debts that you may have, and all sorts of things. So I think you're right. We need to be careful just to say that this is a kind of straight kind of, if you've got a lower income, you're going to find this difficult, and if you've got a higher income, you're not going to find it as difficult. There is nothing. I have to be honest and say there's nothing from this survey that would point us to say whether better financial management would help with that. I mean, it's an entirely different question which we don't cover. Now, we've done other work for sort of debt charities, organisations like Money Advice Scotland, Citizens Advice Scotland, where we look at levels of financial literacy and what's going on in terms of financial education and so forth. And that has exposed, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, I'm afraid, and we're about to do another round of that work. And that has exposed, I think, which is the right word, significant levels of, I suppose, illiteracy would be the right way to. And again, that is not confined to certain demographic sectors of the population. It's across the board to some level or another. So I suspect that while I can't actually give you evidence to say, what proportion of this is just due to income levels and what proportion of that inability to meet an unexpected bill is to do with other factors, I can't tell you. But I suspect that you're right, that there are areas of kind of financial management and financial literacy on an individual level which will play a role in that. It's really, I suppose I'm thinking whether it's something that we can think about doing in later iterations of the survey, because I think it would be something to really kind of hone in on. Particularly seeing those numbers, right? We can see demographics, you can see geographic breakdowns for this, demographic breakdowns. We can do all sorts of fancy analysis on what is actually, but it's all confined to the data that we collect, and we haven't asked those questions. And I think perhaps we should think about doing that in light of some of these stark numbers that I presented earlier on, to be able to understand that a bit better. I think it's a really good point, and two very good questions.
Yeah, thanks. So on the question about spending, so what we do have pretty good information on is how different groups of consumers spend different proportions of their income on different categories of things. So obviously we know, for example, that low-income households spend proportionately more on energy and food, and from that we can work out effective inflation rates. So I think ONS's data for 2022 shows that the lowest income households had a sort of experienced inflation rate of about 12% compared to about 8% for the highest income households. What we've got much less good information about is actually how consumers respond to changes in prices within those categories of things over time. So faced with big increases in food prices overall, how do they sort of manage that and substitute between different types of products at different types of stores? We still don't really have great information on that. You remember there was the big campaign last year by embarrassingly forgotten the name now. The bootstrap cook, as you can, those of you who followed that debate about the extent to which people on low incomes were actually facing an even higher rate of effective inflation because some of the sort of basic range products were disappearing, being withdrawn by the supermarkets, or seeing even faster rising prices. We still don't have a great sort of handle on the real effects of that, I don't think. So that's definitely something where we need to do, well, I'm a research and analysis person, so I always finish slightly boringly by saying we need to do more research on that. The point about debt and why some households with apparently similar levels of income and pressures are more likely to get into debt than others, I think is a really interesting one. I don't have a good answer to that, but you know, it feels like we need to do a lot more to understand how people's attitudes, behaviours, and financial literacy contribute to those differences. But I don't have a good answer off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
I'm just going to ask, I've got questions at the back, I'll come to you in a second. I'm keen to bring in Sheila and just to say a couple of sentences about Great East Transfer and what we found out about financial education.
Yeah, so some of you will know that research, and so we asked people what was the biggest risk to their financial well-being, and it was in this context of the notion that the balance of risk has shifted towards the individual from institutions like government and employers, and we can all see that in our pensions, generally speaking. And a couple of things that are relevant emerged in relation to questions that have been asked and actually what Davy's just said. I mean, I don't think anybody in the business of increasing financial literacy thinks of people as empty vessels to be filled with knowledge, but it was quite clear that there was a requirement from people. They wanted more age and stage appropriate education and learning. But the other issue was when people are in crisis, we use the term cognitive load, which is well known in social research, that people do not have the bandwidth to take on more information. And to the points that Emma and Gemma just made, that the stigma and fear of being found out as someone who'd managed their money badly came out in those interviews quite strongly. So how people wanted to get information and advice, how they wanted to learn, was affected by their material circumstance. If they thought they'd made a mess of it, they really didn't want to talk about it. That much was obvious. So I think what was really important about that research is that we really were showing that if people are feeling under pressure, which quite clearly, you know, some people in this survey are revealing, that is not a good time to start talking about whether they're financially literate enough, and you know, and to inject some information into them, because it's just not absorbable. And that notion that people make, you know, we hear it in relation to food, that if only people learnt to cook, they'd be able to manage their budget better. Well, there may be an element of truth. Most of these things have an element of truth in them, but people are not in a good place to absorb information and to change their habits at a time when there's so much pressure on them. So I think the argument about whether, you know, Shona's point about what sort of world do we want to build out of the crisis that we've been going through? You know, what sort of level of pressure do we want people to be under if we really want people to be able to work themselves out of the place that they're in with some help and support? And they are important, profound questions, I think.
Sheila. I'm going to run hot-footed to the back of the room. I'll take two together.
Thank you. This is a question for Shona. Shona, I know you always like to hear another Northern Ireland accent in the room. Given what we're talking about, Shona, I just wondered if you've landed on your pricing strategy for the festival this year. You know, how do you reconcile the financial challenges in the organisation with being inclusive? And I know, obviously, you did a lot of that last year with your pricing strategy. I was wondering if you're doing anything different this year.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Yeah, I mean, we're using every lever that's available to us to manage the cost for people. So when I said earlier that every show that participates in the Fringe pays a registration fee, we've frozen that this year again for the 15th year in a row, because the art sector, and particularly the freelance art sector, are largely, like a lot of the people you're talking about, they're the people who are holding down 2 or 3 jobs just to be able to pay themselves to keep working in the arts in some way. So there's a massive affordability issue there. So the registration fees have kept frozen for, this is the 15th year. And with the other way we pay ourselves is through commission on the box office. Our commission rate is 4%. I mean, if you take Ticketmaster's 12%. And we've again kept that frozen. This is our 10th year. So there's just no leverage. There's no leverage out there at all to kind of, our community, our artist community would not tolerate. And as you'll all know, they're a very vocal community when they disapprove of something as well. They wouldn't tolerate an increase in the registration fees. And we don't want to put the registration fees up either, is the truth, because inclusivity and access is fundamental. That's its core, be inclusive and access. So yeah, we've very little leverage in those spaces at all. And again, ticketing, the average ticket price for a fringe show is still £11. And it's the reason that our biggest audiences come from across Edinburgh and across Scotland, is because it's managed to remain affordable. So yeah, long-winded way of saying those aren't really places we're going in terms of increasing our income generation.
Okay. I was just wondering, in relation to this attitudes survey, to what extent it might be affected by the life experience and expectations of your participants. Thinking that you said particularly older people had said that they were going to cut down on heating as one of their ways of coping with the cost of living crisis, and recognising that these people probably grew up in homes that didn't have central heating, were told to put on an extra jumper when it got cold, didn't live through mortgage rates at 15 and 17%, as some have done. And I just wondered what impact that had in relation to your findings.
Do you want me to say? Well, it's a good question, and I don't want to kind of overplay this. I mean, the propensity to cut down on energy as energy usage, and that's not just heating, by the way. That's kind of all types of energy. Isn't limited to older people, but we do see an age relationship here. The extent to which that is based on kind of previous experience and how you were, quite possibly. I suppose my hunch would be that it's more likely to be about kind of the current financial situation that you might find yourself in. But I mean, it is entirely possible. I'm not discounting that at all. But I wouldn't like to leave you with the impression that it's only people who are older that are doing this, right? It's apparent in quite large numbers throughout the population. It's just that it's particularly high amongst older people. The reasoning for that, I'm afraid, is unclear from the survey, but it's entirely possible that plays. I would think it's quite a limited role in the choices that people make, but it's entirely possible that it may play some role. It's an interesting point.
Shona, what's the age demographic of the Fringe audience?
It's really interesting. The Fringe audience is unlike most other festivals in that it's got a really wide-ranging demographic. So we've got our kind of loyal friends of the Fringe, and the ones who tend to take up the membership that gives them discounted tickets and all kinds of other offerings tends to be an older demographic. So it tends to be sort of 45 to 65. But we've got a huge demographic that's in that kind of 18 to 35 sort of bracket, and then particularly in the last 20 years, number of children and family shows. And again, just the kind of the results of this survey on families and women in particular making those kinds of choices. You know, it tells us there's going to be even more difficult times, and yet it's so well documented how much it contributes to mental health and well-being for people to be able to engage in the arts and be able to be to go out and be social, and it tackles loneliness and all kinds of other things. So yeah, I do have actual proper slides of the and the breakdown of that. It's just not on my recall this evening, Susan.
I was going to pick up on the previous question actually, because I was really struck right at the start, Mark, with the high level of concern about the healthcare system. And it wasn't obvious that there was such a big pickup the previous winter when actually probably COVID was a bit more present in people's minds. So I was wondering whether there is an evolution in people's thinking that as they turn their heating off, think about how much they eat, they start to worry about their health. And I've certainly heard that from some charities, that people don't just want food or other support. You know, toiletries and hygiene products are really in demand when they're available because people are cutting back on those. And I was wondering whether there's a sort of causation from the poverty into the health, whether you've seen any of that in the data.
To be honest, not absolutely in the data. I think it's an interesting point. I mean, I think when we ask this question, I think it's really important. I think it was Gary I was talking to earlier on about this. It is at a point in time. If you think about you receive this survey, you sit down to do it, and the first question is, what's on your mind at the moment? What's worrying you at the moment? That's going to be impacted by your answer to that. Is going to be impacted by quite a few things that are going to be going on in your head when you answer that question. One of which is, well, what did I last hear about on the news, or what's everyone talking about at the moment? What's my next door neighbour talking about? As well as sort of what's going on in your life. And my interpretation of the fact that healthcare is so high now, and as you say, well, quite significantly higher than this time last year, is that you probably can't move now for hearing how bad the health service is. I mean, it's almost like a new daily statistic out saying, whether it's about delayed discharge or waiting times or whatever, that it is, absolutely just front and center of absolutely everything. And my interpretation of that is, my interpretation of this figure is broadly that.
Thanks, Mark. We've probably got time for one more question before we go. Ooh. Around the edge.
I find what you had to say, Shona, really compelling, and my natural reaction is, right, there must be a fix to this, and my brain immediately says, well, philanthropy must be part of the fix for arts and culture. And I wonder if you would say a little bit about what you think about the culture of philanthropy as it exists in Scotland and the UK today, and I'm particularly interested in what I perceive to be the politicisation of philanthropy. I'm thinking about Sackler being unacceptable as a name. I'm thinking about Covent Garden changing its sponsor. Is it a world in which it's actually more difficult for people to be philanthropic in the arts world?
It's a big question. I think it's definitely a world in which corporate partnerships are more and more tricky in the arts world. So we all have to look at everything through an ethical lens, and we all have an ethical policy in our approach to who we partner with. The individual philanthropic giving is a really interesting one for us, and the Fringe Society has just joined a very long list of people who now has an official mechanism through which to fundraise in the US. And I think it's kind of interesting that we nearly all head to the US because they have such a strong and well-developed history of philanthropic giving. Now, the downside of that is public sector funding for the arts in the US is a disgrace. So we've had a good history of proper public sector investment in the arts in the UK. Scotland, I think, has fallen behind, and in real terms is probably about 30% reduction when you take in inflation and everything else over the last 30 years. So I think we've got a particular issue here, and I think there's a massive work to do to build up a bigger philanthropic giving body right across the UK, and actually particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. We don't have anywhere near what you see in even other parts of Europe, and certainly nothing that comes close to the US, which is why you find nearly every gallery, museum, arts organisation has some channel for trying to raise funds philanthropically in the US. But yeah, anybody's got any bright ideas around that in this room, it would be great to see. And even some of the biggest donors here, I mean, you see the Dunard Foundation. I mean, that's Carol Grigger, who is from the US. You know, even some of the biggest philanthropic givers here tend to come from that part of the world. So yeah, I'd love to see more of it. I think it could absolutely be part of the answer, particularly in the next 2 or 3 years. I mean, 2022, there was still cultural recovery funds. So even an organisation like the Fringe that hasn't had to have public sector investment before got support in 2022, and that made the difference. It's what put the festivals back on the stage this year, last year. But there's nothing like that now. So to me, 2023, 2024, 2025 are actually the massive risk years.
Thanks, Christine. Great question. If there are any philanthropists in the room, I'm sure Shona would love to speak to you afterwards. Equally, the David Hume Institute is a small charity funded entirely on philanthropic donations. So I'll also mention that we are always looking for donors. And I think it's worth pointing out, you know, I've worked in fundraising on and off over many years for different organisations. It is incredibly hard to raise unrestricted income because quite often the donors want to tie down or name something, or sometimes one charity I worked for, the donor wanted to do something the charity didn't want to do, and there was an incredibly ethical question about, do they take the money and do the thing the donor wants to do, even though they know it's the wrong thing to do? And so sometimes it can be an incredible amount of work managing a philanthropist. So if you are one, please be easy to manage. On that note, I'll be cheeky and go to the panel for one final sentence before we finish. David, do you want to leave us with a sentence?
Yes, you did warn me about this. Completely forgotten about it. But I think, you know, really genuinely mean this, really useful report. Really hope to see it continue for the foreseeable future. And I think it will be really interesting to see how perceptions of the cost of living crisis evolve throughout the rest of the year. Particularly if we get this sort of schism between how trends in the economy are being reported and how people are continuing to feel those in their pockets, so to speak. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm not going to go away with a bleak view. I'm going to go away with a view that there's lots of people in this room, people with influence and relationships and connections, and don't leave it to turn to the arts to help whenever everything's completely and absolutely broken. We're here and want to be part of the ongoing health and well-being of the nation. So literally all I'm asking you guys to do is come and see a show, take a punt, buy a ticket, take your families, because that's how these things are going to survive.
Thank you. I mean, I really like these sessions because they I sort of spend quite a lot of time in dark rooms with lots of numbers, and actually it allows me to. I like the challenge. Like people ask me to sort of interpret data in ways that I haven't kind of thought of before, which I think is really quite helpful and stimulating and challenging. And there's actually ideas for other ways in which other routes the survey can go down, which I think, particularly back to the points that you were making around kind of financial management and stuff, which I think are really interesting things for us to look at. The survey's evolving all the time. We're committed to keep doing it. We love the relationship with Susan and her team. So we're here for the long term, and hopefully we'll have many more evenings like this to chew the numbers over and and actually what they mean. The important thing is what they mean rather than the numbers themselves. So, yeah, thank you again. It's always a really enjoyable discussion.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Shona. Thanks, David. So it just leaves for me to close the event. We love doing this survey, not because we enjoy sitting looking at depressing graphs. We do it because we want everyone to think about the so what. And there are trends here we need to think about, even once the cost of living crisis moves out of the news. And it's not really a crisis now. We're stuck with a cost of living that's higher than a lot of people's wages. And we need to think about that. We need to think about the fact that 40% of people on universal credit are in work. So we've got low wages that aren't paying enough to live on. And what does that mean long term? If we've got people losing so much sleep and they're not fit to go to work, what does that do to our labour market? Those big questions are there. How are we going to raise our productivity if a third of our workforce is losing sleep? If our children and the next generation are being affected by tired and grumpy parents, I can say, because when I lose sleep, I am very definitely grumpy. We need to think about that. And Shona said, long term, this isn't about the day-to-day. This is about what trends we're seeing that are going to have long-term impacts. And we can see it there. There are long-term public health implications from lack of sleep, living in cold houses. We know heart attack rates go up. I think David McColgan was meant to be here, but I can't see him in the room. He's from the British Heart Foundation. He would tell us that heart attacks go up as soon as people get cold consistently over a long period of time. There are lots of so what's in here, and each time we do one of these events, you will get a different panel and a different reflection, because we think it's important to build that conversation. And I love the fact that Sian is here tonight and he was on the panel last time. So do keep that relationship. As the David Hume Institute, we want to know our audience and we want you to be part of the conversation, not just it to be sitting at the front and speaking one way. This is about diversity of thought in the room, and you are all part of that. So please do come along, feel welcome, and have your voices heard. And on that note, I will just thank the panel, thank Brodie's for hosting us again in this lovely venue. We really do appreciate it. For anyone wondering about it, it's an in-kind donation. So thank you, Christine, for arranging that. So there are lots of ways to give to the David Hume Institute. We do appreciate any help we can get. And just thank you for coming. Thank you very much, everybody.